All right. Well, looks like it's a couple minutes after 2, so I'm going to go ahead get us started with some introductory stuff here. People still might be filtering in. That is a-okay, especially if they miss this kind of like overview at the top. They'll be here for the main training. So welcome everybody to our training this afternoon, hosted by the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. This training is Undoing Implicit Bias in Building Decarbonization. We're joined by Stephanie Bowman of Mothers Out Front. I will introduce her in just a moment, but first, just a little bit of centering about Midwest BDC and what you can expect from today's training. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to do this kind of welcome and introduction section up top, just a little bit about Midwest BDC and the community norms we like to follow during these meetings and trainings. Then I will introduce Stephanie and really just turn it over to her for the bulk of the training today. And then we'll come back together at the end for a question and answer period and a closing together. All right, so the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition seeks to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. That is our mission here at the coalition. And this graphic shows how we define the Midwest. We know like a lot of people maybe view that definition differently depending on where they live, but our focus is in Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and Iowa. We have members from outside of that region, some of those bordering states, or, from national organizations who are just interested and passionate about this work too. So we welcome folks from all over, but this is kind of where we focus a lot of our work in Midwest BDC. We have 3 full-time coalition staff members. So Marnice Jackson, who could not make it today, she texted me that she might be able to join on to listen for a bit. She's traveling right now, but so hopefully Marnice might be able to join for a minute. She's our co-director and manager of community engagement and equity, and she's based out of Pontiac, Michigan. Jacob, I think I saw Jacob on the call if he wants to come off mute and introduce himself real quick.
Hi, yes, I'm Jacob Surfling. I'm the other co-director of the coalition, and I'm based out of Des Moines, Iowa.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. And then my name is Maggie Heiser. I'm our communications manager, and I'm based out of Columbus, Ohio. And once Stephanie really takes the training today, I will still be on here. So if anyone has any technical issues, any questions, or just needs help with anything, feel free to direct message me in the Zoom call, and I'll be able to help out with any of that stuff. All right. And then moving on, we like to start these calls and trainings and meetings with kind of a grounding in an Indigenous and enslaved people's land acknowledgement. I will drop a link to this in the chat for anyone who wants to follow along, and then I will go ahead and just read this quickly. So let's pause for a moment to contemplate an Indigenous land and enslaved peoples. We have to start with honesty. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom dating back centuries for many Native communities and nations. For non-Indigenous communities, land acknowledgement is a way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous peoples of the land on which we work and live. We invite you to recognize the written histories of the United States, specifically Midwestern states, as fractured. Let us acknowledge then that we are currently on the land of the Indigenous who continue to be systematically erased by policies and practices that remove their histories from this place. Let us honor the enslaved people who built the wealth and the foundation of the United States. Let us recognize the histories of the United States as complicit with the racism of white supremacy. We recognize that these difficult histories persist in present-day racial realities and privileges within our movement of building decarbonization. We commit to dismantling racism in the spaces where we work. We invite you to work beside us to create change. Please understand that our intentions are not to participate in gaslighting pedagogy or to practice to relive the guilt of colonizers and/or white supremacy culture. Our intentions are to work towards giving land back and fighting for reparations. And like I said, put that link in the chat there if anyone wants to follow along or take that to read after our call today. All right, so next up, we will go through some of the community norms that we practice at our meetings here today. I will ask for some participation if folks are able. So if you see that raise hand function in the Zoom, feel free to click that and then I can have you go off mute and read along with us. So I will start with reading these blue sections and then I will ask for folks to read the green, orange, gray, and yellow squares if they can. So first up for the blue, listen for understanding, not to respond, show up in your authentic self, and speak to the whole group. And then is anyone able to read those green boxes for us? If not, I can go ahead and do the green ones as well. So the green ones are practice self-awareness.
I'll go ahead, Maggie.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Pressey. Go for it. And then I think I saw Alexis with their hand up as well.
Okay.
So, go ahead.
We're reading the green, practice self-awareness. Everyone is a teacher. One's a learner. Minimize the use of jargon and explain terms when you are asked.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Pressey. Anyone want to do those orange boxes for us? Oh, perfect, Alexis.
Notice intent, lean towards impact. WAIT, wait, why am I talking? Why aren't I talking? Share responsibility for keeping to the norms, participate, and lean into discomfort.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Anyone want to do those gray ones for us?
I can read it.
Thanks.
Well, maybe, I don't think, hold on one second. I have a lot going on.
No,
Okay,
you're good.
Use I statements, practice active listening, adhere to speak next indicators, stack or raise hands.
Perfect. Thank you. And then I see Eslyn has her hand up. Eslyn, if you want to take those yellow ones for us.
Okay, I sure will. Assume good intentions. On screen, off screen. Stop and witness.
Awesome. Thanks, Eslyn. And just a little clarity, that on-screen, off-screen means that we don't have a hard rule that people have to have their cameras on or have their cameras off. We know that, a lot of us might be traveling, multitasking, working in places where we just don't want our cameras on. So that is okay. We definitely recommend it if you're able to. It's really nice, especially when we're in those breakout rooms and talking face-to-face with one another, but we understand that's not always easy for everybody. All right, then on to the next slide. If everybody can go on your Zoom and just make sure that your name is correct, reflective of your name. And if you want to add your location in there as well, that kind of just helps us remember who we're talking to and orient each other in the space. So it shows up there. You can click on those little, I think it's like 3 dots by your name. That should let you do that. All right, so moving into more about the training we are attending today, Undoing Implicit Bias and Building Decarbonization. If people are not aware, this is actually just the first section in a 2-part series that Stephanie is doing for us. So next week at the same time, 2 to 4 on Thursday, we will have white supremacy culture and building decarbonization, kind of a 2nd-part training from Stephanie. And I will go ahead and just drop that link in the chat for folks to register for that. So if you're not registered for the next one, feel free to go click through there and make sure it's on your calendar. All right, and with that, I will go ahead and introduce our trainer and facilitator and presenter today, Stephanie Bowman of Mothers Out Front. Let's see, I'll find, oh, perfect. So Stephanie is joining us from Mothers Out Front. Before joining Mothers Out Front, Stephanie was a battleground state grasshopper for various gubernatorial, congressional, issue-based, NGO, and presidential campaigns. From age 14, she knew a life in environmental justice was inevitable. From growing and delivering freshly picked vegetables to neighbors' doors, canvassing with AFSCME, in protesting a predatory utility company. So she received a bachelor's in political science from Hampton University, and she began organizing from Virginia, Wisconsin, to Kansas. 6 states later, she felt disgusted about the transactional treatment by party politics. Her first passion for national work and research led her to Cornell and marketing strategy to learn how to test ways to engage folks nationally using digital tactics. Her second passion is facilitating tough conversations around race and class and moving towards measurable change with equity and justice at the core. So if everyone wants to welcome Stephanie, I'll go ahead and stop the screen share and give it over to her to lead us through this training today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm super thankful to be here. Once again, my name is Stephanie Bowman. I go by she, her pronouns. I live usually in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I'm originally from Kansas City, Kansas. So technically under your Midwest map, I'm not considered Midwest, but at heart, I was raised as Midwesterner. Kansas City, Kansas is the Midwest, but I can see you all may not consider that, and that's okay. I am actually based today in Oahu, Hawaii. I am moving my college student into college. And so if you hear Hawaiian music and waterfalls in the background, that's for you to just set the tone today as we begin to have this conversation together. If it looks like there's 2 of me in today's call, it is. I'm also on my phone and on my computer. So no worries, you can chat either one. But as I set up my screen share, here we go. So what we're going to be diving into over the next 2 days, and thank you, Maggie, for the intro, is understanding implicit bias in building decarbonization work. And so you're like, Stephanie, why is this on a freeway sign? We're not doing transit justice. Okay, but it's because this is a process. You all already have your work, your projects, the organizations that you are with, and you're on a set path of goals. But when we talk about our understanding our own implicit bias, this is a detour a little bit off of our highway that we're on. And it's us making a conscious effort that we need to stop, reconsider, and then get back on the freeway of our work. All right, so if you're wondering why each day I have a freeway sign, it's because this is a process and this is a journey, and we're taking this next exit together. So as we shared earlier, please rename yourself. If some of you are coming in on your phone, it's okay just to use some initials. It just makes it easier for us to identify folks when you have questions. So you already did this slide, so I'm going to skip over it, but as we know, we're all here because we're building decarbonization, and that is the process of reducing or eliminating the emissions that contribute to climate change from building energy sources. We met, some of us, a year ago, and we dove into what that looks like, and we talked about if it's converting appliances like furnaces, water heaters, stoves, and fossil fuels to clean, carbon-free electricity. And so that's just some of the things I have listed here. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about Mothers Out Front. Mothers Out Front is a climate justice organization, and our working vision statement, because we just went through a transformation process, is that we believe that future generations should enjoy just access to a healthy environment. Our working mission statement, which for some of you who saw me a year ago are like, Stephanie, this is kind of different. Yeah, it is. In the past, we organized for mothers to ensure a healthy climate for all children. And during our strategic process, we realized that we needed to make it explicit that our goal and our focus area is by transforming unjust systems. So it's not a big change, but it's a subtle one and powerful. Our theory of change is that if multiracial cross-class coalition of mothers that are oriented towards climate justice execute well-supported local, state, and cross-state campaigns, then they will make measurable progress with a healthy climate for all children. So we're truly grassroots at its core, and we mobilize moms who generally either are working or working, if it's at home or if it's in an office. And we organize and continue to organize primarily women, primarily mothers, caregivers, with a focus on expanding our audience to include more Black, Indigenous, and people of color, more LGBTQ folks, working class, low income, and directly impacted people. We now are explicitly saying that we will not work with people who are not values aligned. All right. So what does that mean? Today is going to be a brave space. All right. I can't promise that the space will be safe. But I can promise that we will make the space brave. But it involves everyone's commitment today. So the first commitment is to be open and honest. If I ask a hard question and you're like, ooh, I don't know if I want to answer it, take a breath, write your answer in the chat, and hit enter. Because the only way we can move forward is by us being open and honest with each other. The second is we got to step up and step back. If you are talking, you love to talk, and we're in a breakout room, please acknowledge your privilege of loving to talk. Not everyone does, and step back and make space for folks who don't. The third is, y'all, assumptions hurt. And so we're going to talk about assumptions today, but we have to make them explicit because that is part of the process. So back to that first one, when I ask, hey, y'all, what assumptions show up and you're hesitating because you're like, this is kind of offensive, we have to make it explicit in order for us to get through this process together. So that's the brave part. And the last one, brave space, means that we are committing to uncomfortableness. All right. For folks who do this work and the space doesn't always represent us, we may be used to a level of discomfort, but us all committing to be uncomfortable is where the transformation lies. I'm going too fast. All right, so participation will look like, one, looking at a slide deck and listening, which you're doing right now. Two, interact in the chat with numbers. I know some of you are maybe driving or on the road, so please do not text and drive. That's not what I'm asking for. But if you are able to message or anything like that once you're parked, please interact in the chat with numbers. Three, there will be breakouts. I would prefer that you could be on audio or microphone because there's just a human approach to just being able to hear folks' voice, texts and everything. And then last, if you have questions as we're going through this, please feel free to put them in the chat. It doesn't mean I'll be able to answer all of them, but it makes it easier for myself and for Maggie to be able to identify which questions we can answer today. All right, so we're going to test out what participation looks like. And I'm gonna bring my chat up because I'm doing this dual screen stuff, which is so much fun. Okay, so let's do the first. Have you attended this training in the past? 5 is like completely. It was this exact training. I remember you. It was last year. You can put a 5 in the chat. If you're like somewhat, I think I kind of hopped in and hopped out. I couldn't really be fully present. Judge-free zone. Go ahead and put a 3 in the chat. And you're like, no, I don't even know what is implicit bias. Go ahead and just put a 1 in the chat. All right, I see a 5, I see some 1s, I see some 3s. Okay, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Tammy. Imani, okay, 2, 1, okay. All right, I see some 5s. We got some few 5s out here. Thank you. I may call on you today to read certain slides. No pressure. Thank you. All right, I see some 3s, some 1s. Yes, Marnice, I see the 10. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, so this is what participation will look like. I like to do temperature checks just to see how things are resonating with folks and if this is helpful. And so just feel free. If you're unable to give a number, eventually I'll put a part in the chat, which is what I'm about to do now, to go to the next question. All right, so how well do you understand implicit bias? 5 is like, Stephanie, I do implicit bias training. Like you may not even be able to teach me anything today. That's okay. Put a 5 in the chat. 3 is like, I mean, I've done it here or there, but I really never done it in regards to decarb work. And then 1 is like implicit bias. What is that? I don't know. Maybe some bias. I'm kind of unsure. All right, I see a lot of 3s coming in. Okay. 1 if this means the specific training, 3 if this is type of the training. Okay. 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 I see some ones. I see some threes and some twos. Okay. All right, I'm just gonna give a few more seconds. I think that was everyone as far as my counting goes. I feel like there may be one straggler out there that hasn't given a number. Okay. There we go. Okay. All right, I just want to make space. It just makes it easier for me to craft and move through certain parts differently based on you all. Okay, thank you. All right, Beatrice. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one. So make your vote now. Otherwise, I have to put a break in the chat to keep up. All right. All right. So this is a deeper dive. How well do you understand implicit bias and how it shows up in decarbonization? 5 is like, I completely understand. You're like, I see the through line on how folks' unconscious bias shows up in our decision-making processes. And 3 is like, I mean, I kind of see it, but really, is it there? Like, you're still like on the fence. You're like, I don't know. And then 1 is like, not at all. I don't even know why we're having this training because it's just not there. And this is okay. This is us checking in and being honest and open about where we are. Okay. All right. So I see some 3s. Okay. Some 4s, some 5, a 3.8. Okay. You're giving me decimals. All right. Okay. Okay. So it looks like we have a lot of folks in the middle on how well you understand, which is great, which means we can get into the juicy prompts today and we don't have to necessarily get lost in all the icing, which is great. Okay, let's move through this one. All right. So there was some pre-reading and I just wanted to do a brief check and it's okay, no pressure if you didn't do it. But 1, if you're like, oh yeah, Stephanie, I read that pre-reading. And 2, you're like, no, Stephanie, what pre-reading? I didn't get one. And it's okay if not, it just helps me know how to move forward. No worries, Sarah. Yes, I can do that. I'll do it once you all are back from this breakout because I have to stop screen sharing to find the link and do all that. But yes, I can do that too. No worries. That's how we're doing this check-in. If you didn't do it, it's okay. All right, that's fine. All right, so some brief goals for today. We're going to gain some alignment around some common terminology because often a lot of the implicit bias work shows up in ways where people assume people know things that folks may not know. So we're going to gain some alignment around some common terminology. We want to make sure that folks leave with tools on how to apply this equity into your active campaigns or the work that you're doing. We also want to specify how this connects to decarb work specifically. And so I'm going to be giving you a series of prompts that you will be able to process yourself, but also be able to take back to your orgs or your group, the folks that you work with, and use these prompts as ways of accountability checks on if your work is actually transformational and equitable and making sure everyone has a seat at the table. And then the last is you will leave with the workbook with all of the links that I'm going to share, the slide deck, the worksheets, the breakouts, all of those things. I am only going to share them day by day because I know there's eager beavers who will hop ahead and try to look to everything at day 2. But like I said, this is a process. We were going down the decarb highway together and we just took this exit and we're all taking the exit. And you can run ahead and go to the next exit because that's for next week. So all that to say, just the eager beavers, take a breath. We're going to get through this together. All right. So now we're just going to get ready to do some parent shares just to loosen us up, get everyone talking a little bit together. Yes. And so the prompt for you to go to your breakout room is, what ways do you see bias show up in decarbonization work? And now this isn't a time to trauma dump, respectfully, okay? But this is a time for you to try to be concise. You're like, hey, I see it show up in microaggressions. I kind of see it show up in decision making. And just really kind of, no worries. Yes, there will be a recording. Thank you. And so just try to keep it as concise as possible, because we only have 10 minutes together. So you can't drop it off, but at least try to get it concise so you all can talk through lines. And with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing so that you all can go into your parent shares. And like I said, we have to be open and honest in order for us to get through this process together. So let's try not to sugarcoat it.
All right,
Maggie,
thanks. Yep, perfect. I'm going to set those breakout rooms right now. And then we had 10 minutes for those, right? All right, perfect. So some folks might have, I think there might be 1 or 2 groups of 3, but most of us will be in pairs. Assign automatically. All right, so we will see you back here. So it's 2:30 right now. So 2:40, we'll all be back in this main room together. Ooh, all right, well, welcome back into this main session, everyone. I hope that the conversations worked. I think next time we might try to assign folks to breakout rooms, because I think there's a little bit of confusion there. So apologies for that, but hope there are still some good conversations had. And I'll turn it back over to Stephanie.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Maggie. Yeah, it always feels like 10 minutes is not enough time when you start talking about bias work, because there's a lot of context that needs to be given, right, when we're having these conversations. And so if folks are feeling spicy and you're like, man, I want to share the deets of what happened in our call, just don't name names as far as the share outs. But just feel free to just type in the chat some top lines that you heard in which ways bias shows up in decarbonization work. And I'll give a couple of minutes for folks. And if you're driving and you're like, Stephanie, I really want to share, but I can't type, just feel free to raise your hand, because we have a little time for a few people to share out.
As
All right,
opposed to writing it, Stephanie?
Yes, if you didn't want to write it, or you're like, I can't right now, we have time for a few people to share out.
Okay, I'll share out with for my group. And it's a joke to call it a group, because I don't know what happened here. It was just 2 of us in there, me and Dr. Pressey. I was kind of looking for some other people, but I don't know how many.
It was just a parent share for this one, so no worries. It was only supposed to be 2. The next one will be a larger group.
Oh, it's supposed to be only 2 in each. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we looked at implicit bias, Dr. Pressey and I, as far as like, we took our community, for instance, and it's just like, you know, we got certain parts of our towns that just kind of went up like since 2002. So they're new, and we clearly see that. So, you know, they would get the newer stuff or whatever, and anything more advanced, you know. But I think we looked at it as far as implicit, is that we seem to be in back this way, which is called the southeast side in my town. That seemed like whatever new is coming out, we seem to get it last, you know. So we look at that as an implicit or bias, and also systemic. It's like, you know, whenever we get to it, we'll get to you when we get to you. That kind of mentality. And that's the part of, like, you know, it's kind of sickening. You know, you see things going on in the city, you know, you pay taxes like everyone else, you know, and it's like sometimes you just sick and tired of being last all the time. It's like, okay, we got the new stuff, but why can't they start on my side of the town first? You know, it just, that's kind of stuff. You know, if they're fixing the streets, why can't they start on my side of the town first? You know, why, you know, it's just that kind of thing. So, and that's what we were kind of looking at that as an example, as far as implicit stuff, you know, and it seemed like it's the same old, same old. The least, the less, the lost, the last is really last, you know. So
Yeah.
anyway, it was, you know, it was a little disturbing even. This is kind of, and I will further, while we're talking about implicit biases, you know, it was a little struggle for me to be on this call. You know, I guess I'm a lady of a certain age, and excuse me, although I was reared more here in the, as we Southerners say, in the North instead of the South. I was reared more in the North, but I was reared by Southern parents and Southern, you know, cousins and so on and so forth. So even though some things, I think they didn't say it because they were conscious of our young minds around and didn't want to pass that on, you know, it's felt. Children feel everything from their parents. And, you know, and although I'm not a parent, I've been well parented. And when I see other things going on, I readily notice it, you know, even with stuff like this, you know, so it just seems like, you know, it was a little kind of, I don't know if I want to hear all of this, because I feel like in a lot of ways I know it all too well, and it just kind of rake over old wounds, you know, and although if you didn't have the wounds directly, you got it indirectly, you know, it was around you, and because it was so around you, is still that was still you, you know. Yeah, so you know, I thought, well, I don't know if I want to be in this call or not, you know. So I went on and got online in a way because I thought that would be a good way to kind of break through some of this, and at the same time I felt like as a group you all could help me, and I could see some other alternative, you know, other ways and so forth. So I took it as learning and growth. So just gotta bear with me a little bit today, okay?
No worries. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being open and honest. It's not easy to come on these calls as Black people, as Indigenous people,
Right.
as low class people, because there's also a lot of assumptions that people make, right? And that's the next part we're going to go into. And those assumptions hurt. And sometimes we get exhausted and tired of them.
Yes.
And so that's why, to my white allies who are on the call, sometimes you have to give us grace with frustration and irritability,
so
because
true.
Implicit bias feels like mosquito bites, y'all.
Yeah,
and there's only so many you can get until you're just a cranky person. No matter how much you meditate, no matter how much you pray, you're still gonna feel cranky, right? And so it's grace that's deserved, and I appreciate you.
That. I feel good that you
appreciate
understand.
you.
Thank you, kindly.
Yes, no worries. So I'm just going to share out some things that I see in the chat, y'all. I see folks saying bias shows up in all levels of our work, from developing campaigns that align with BIPOC values and priorities, to how federal money is being structured to be a real heavy lift for BIPOC communities that lack the capacity to compete for those funds, right? And we don't mean the lack of capacity in a competency thing. We mean lack of capacity, like there's only so many jobs that you can manage in a family and things until you just don't have any more hours left in the day, right? My wise parents share partner mentioned ways that we can be impatient with one another and expect beginners to try to catch up to experts. Yes, rather than bring everyone along, jumping in and using acronyms and meetings, and you just assume everyone knows what those acronyms mean. Yes, and expecting folks to know exactly what element in your lung is a particulate. I'm not going to say some folks don't care, but they just need to know, what do we do to change it? They may not need or want to know exactly what that particulate is called, right? I see, yes, we also talk about bias on location, the way that coal plants, natural gas plants, landfills, highways are most often placed in Black and Brown, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Yes, and back to Lena's point, it's also who is sacrificable, right? There's an assumption and there's an association to who is sacrificable in making some of these decisions. And a lot of it is inherently biased, right? Because some folks are like, well, low-class people don't take care of their neighborhoods or their communities. So, you know, yeah, they deserve to be sacrificed. We can put the polluter there.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily something that's verbalized or that's written, but it's like this association where they're like, well, they don't deserve that, right? And so when we talk about like humanity, and the reason why implicit bias impacts our ability to treat each other like we're all humans is because there's this association that certain humans deserve certain things and certain humans don't. Right. And like you said, it can be your elders, it can be people who are raised around you where it could have been spoken or unspoken, but you can feel it. Right. Yeah. So I also see folks saying they had similar conversations. Yes, it's hard to have these conversations. If you get frustrated and you're like, Stephanie, I need to go off camera because I'm about to go off camera, take 3 breaths. I'm here. I understand. Okay. Jargon is so alienating. Yes, it is. Department heads thought it was perfectly okay to implicit bias in the decision to build a compressed natural gas facility in a predominantly Black neighborhood that is on the rebound because it was a convenient location for commuters leaving the urban core for more suburban white areas. Yes, we also know that implicit bias is used in developing, right? Like what parts of the city deserve these amenities and what parts of the cities don't. What parts of the city deserve building upgrades and what parts of the city don't. And that's inherently rooted in bias, right? Like if you're an elected official and you were raised in that area that's getting said that they don't deserve something, you will have your unique positionality in the world makes you have more humanity for that community because that's your community, right? All right, I see some more folks. BIPOC communities can be completely left out of the important policy conversation. Yes, and there's an assumption that we don't care about those issues or assumption that we don't have time. And like everything, y'all, we're not a monolith, right? We're all uniquely different. So I see some folks being like, Stephanie, let's get to these definitions. I got you. That's the next slide. We're getting there. I just wanted to make time for us to unpack this together because us naming things will be the through line through these next 2 days together. Okay. All right. Of course, my video will show up on where I'm sharing my screen. Superb. All right. So implicit bias, y'all. Implicit bias are those attitudes or those stereotypes that affect understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And the reason why I'm using the word unconscious is because we're going to talk about implicit versus explicit bias. Okay. And the two are different. And that's why this training together is so great because we're going to make some stuff explicit, which means moving forward, if you still choose to do it, then it's not implicit bias anymore. It's explicit. Okay. Like we've had the conversation, we're working through it together. And for some folks who are like, Stephanie, I need to read this in the chat because you learn differently. I got you. I also have the definition in the chat. So someone asked what bias is that prejudice, favor, or against one thing. That can be a person, a group compared with another. Bias can show up super light, right? Like, oh, I'm biased to chai lattes. I don't want anything else. I don't drink coffee. It makes me sick. If I go somewhere, I will naturally read it. Could I technically drink something else? Yes. Will I die from drinking something else? No. But that's like a bias that I have where I desire and want this thing. And I almost have prejudice against it because if I see anything else, I almost cringe. Like my unconscious association is like, yuck, coffee is bitter, right? But then implicit bias is where we're talking about human behavior between people. Right. So that occurs when someone consciously rejects stereotypes and supports anti-discrimination efforts, but also holds negative associations in their mind unconsciously. All right. And so in my conversation with Sarah, we were talking about how assumptions are wrapped into this. And so often when we talk about assumptions, folks confuse presumption with assumption. So we're first going to just get clarity on the difference between the two. Okay. So to presume is to make an important guess based on available proof, right? So we may be able to say, okay, renters who make less than $80,000 a year, okay, may not have access to discretionary funds that they can use to switch all of their stoves to induction. Okay, I'm just throwing that out there. That's based on some evidence, right? It's not truly rooted in an assumption because there is some proof that folks under this who make this certain amount of money may not have the additional funds to be able to switch to induction, right? That does involve some evidence. Doesn't mean that it's conclusive. No, okay? It's less likely to come true. So they're both not necessarily something that you root all of your campaign on, but it's important for you to know the difference between a presumption and an assumption. Now, the assumption is just supposed without proof. It involves no evidence, are less likely to come true, okay? Often we see assumptions like folks shared in policies and decision-making where folks make assumptions and it involves no evidence and it's less likely to come true. Now, I just want to name, because last year I got feedback and someone was like, Stephanie, but what about selective evidence? And so I just want to share that selective evidence is something we're going to talk about in day 2 around white supremacy culture. But yes, evidence can always be used in a selective way where someone can choose it to make presumptions, right, that are still rooted in implicit bias, right? And most of us have probably seen that in our work where they choose one little statistic and they use that one statistic as a reason to make a lot of assumptions, right? And so I just wanted to name that. It's not as clear cut as we think, but we know that there's some tactics folks use to murky the two. So let's talk about it. What assumptions do you have? And when I say you, I don't mean you personally, I mean like your organization, the group that you represent. What assumptions do you have in regards to homeowners, in regards to decarbonization work? And just feel free to share in the chat. Yes, can really perhaps assume they're more wealthy, right? And in some cases, it could be a presume, right? Like there's some evidence that they're in a certain income bracket, right? But is that like 100% evidence that we can use to show that all people who are homeowners are wealthy? No, there's some people who are homeowners that are barely able to pay their mortgage, that are still living paycheck to paycheck, right? So yeah, homeowners may be presumed more likely to care about these significant types of issues. Yeah, some people presume that homeowners care more about their property, right? And that there'll be more upgrades or things that they will want to do to their property. Is that true? No. Thank you, Maggie. More likely to take advantage of rebate benefits for upgrading appliances, like you mentioned. Yep, because they live in that home compared to landlords who rent out. Yeah, it's making assumptions of wants when building low income or affordable housing. Exactly. Like, how do you really know that's what they want? Did you survey them? Most homeowners are disciplined, yes, which if anyone's had a bad neighbor who's a homeowner, they don't necessarily have to be disciplined. They could be more radical because there's not a written rules of what they can do. Homeowners understand more complex information about retrofitting. Yeah, I would definitely say that's an assumption. Older homeowners may not be considering solar panels, especially because they think it's a scam. Yeah. And there's also like implicit bias around generations, right? Where we have associations to certain generations behaving and acting a certain way, right? As we all know, who may represent different generations on this call, we're all not a monolith. All Gen Xers aren't the same. All baby boomers aren't the same. All Gen Zers aren't the same. We're all uniquely different, right? But we often kind of naturally have those unconscious associations. The moment someone tells us how old we are, we're like, woo, wait, let me think of all the people I know that are in that age range, and how was my experience with them, and was it good, and were they responsible? And you kind of have all those series of thoughts as you continue to engage with them, right? Okay, I'm green when it comes to the techie stuff, but what's NMK? Yeah, what is NMK? Never mind. Okay, I don't know. All right, so let's go forward. So implicit bias. Some folks always ask, okay, Stephanie, well, when do we get to the isms? All right, I got an image for you because folks are visual learners. So over here to the left, we have implicit bias. This white woman is like, oh, I see you, you're a person of color, right? The unconscious association is in those first 3 to 5 seconds of engagement. It's the thoughts in your mind. That's why us having this honest conversation is important, because these are thoughts in your mind. Okay, I can't control what you think. Okay, it's you that can control what you think, but you first have to acknowledge that you're thinking these things, right? So some association she may have is like, oh, I wonder if she's a singer, that she can sing. Okay, it may be like, oh, you know, are you a dancer? Or do you know people who commit crimes? Like, you could be friends with people who commit crimes, right? Whatever that is, it's those first series of thoughts that you have in your mind. And they always don't have to be negative. Sometimes you can have good associations, right? Talents, skills, things that you think people know. I was recently on a call with a whole bunch of folks who are variants of South Asian. And this person on the call was like, I assume everybody on the call knows how to do this techie thing. And then people on the call were like, actually, I'm horrible with technology. And it made us have a whole conversation how this person made an assumption that because this was like a predominantly South Asian call, that we would have tech masters on the call, right? It's crazy. But for them, they had that unconscious association that they've gone so long and it's been unchecked, right? Like, no one ever was like, you know, you probably shouldn't say or do that. Now you're like, okay, Stephanie, but when does this become racist? So there's this line, all right? And as you see that line, it says, when do you see? So implicit is when it's in your head, okay? It's when it's internal. It's when it's unconscious. The moment you become aware that, hey, every time I walk by a Black man, I clench my purse. And now that I've said it, now you know that's an implicit bias. Then when you do it again, okay, and someone can visibly see that, that can be an act that can be perceived as being a racist, a classist, sexist, whatever the is, right? And so once you become conscious and you choose to do it moving forward, that is what makes it explicit. All right. And that's why sometimes people like to avoid these trainings, because there is some like validity in like living your life and not going unchecked, and then you're like, oh, I never knew. But is that really helpful to the work we're trying to do? No. So that's why I commend all of you that are on the call today, because becoming conscious and aware of your own implicit biases is how we really do this transformational work together. All right. So that's all I'm going to talk about for now, because I know that was a lot. And so we are going to do a breakout group. This will be more than 2 people for those that are like, I need more folks. And in this breakout group, we're going to talk about what assumptions or presumptions do you make about renters and decarbonization work. And I would like to have a note taker that's willing to take notes of what folks say. You can take it in whatever document you want. And all I ask is when you come back to the chat to just be able to copy and paste those notes into the chat. And so Maggie, I wanted to give folks 15 minutes.
Perfect. I will set those up right now. I'll try to aim for like 4 to 5 people in a group. Does that sound okay, Stephanie?
Yes, that sounds perfect.
All right, cool. All right, 15 minutes. And some folks did it last time too, but I think there's a button in those rooms where if you are having trouble, where it can like flag me essentially, and then I can try to come in and help you out. I'm going to try to do it a little bit of a different way this time though, so hopefully we don't have that confusion, and I will assign people to different rooms. All right, so I'm going to start sending folks into those rooms. Oh, I see a note from Sarah in the chat real quick. I am not sure if there's a notes app in Zoom. You might be able to just like type in the chat, honestly, and like not send it yet, if that makes sense. Or maybe pull up like a Google Doc or something if that's easy.
Or
All
if
right.
you just wanted to send it to me, you can as well.
That's a good idea. All right, I will start sending folks in there and then we'll meet back here in 15 minutes.
Thank you everyone for joining us back from the breakouts. For those of you that were the note takers, now is the time for you to copy and paste your notes in the chat. And for those of you that aren't note takers, now is the time for you to read the chat. And you have this really cool feature in Zoom where you can use emojis. And so if something resonates with you, you can give it a 100, you can give it a thumbs up, you can heart it. And if something is like shocking for you, there's also other emojis that are like shocked face. You're like, oh, I didn't know that. And so I just want to give folks a few minutes to put that in the chat and other folks a few minutes to read the chat.
Hey Maggie, it's Tammy. Real quick, my chat, my notes won't go in because they're too long. Do you know what the word count is so I could break this out quickly or no?
Oh no, I don't know off the top of my head. Let me see if I can Google it real quick.
Yeah, I've never had it not say that you could, it was too much.
Oh, it does say up to 500 characters. So
okay, that helps. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great question. I didn't know that.
Me neither.
So I guess Zoom limits us now. I don't think that used to be a thing.
How dare them?
All right. I see some great stuff coming into the chat. So for those that are just listening in, I'm going to read some of the things that I see, just so you don't have to try to pull over to read. So some of them, it says they're just renters. They don't know how long they're going to stay and care for the unit. The temporary occupants, so they're not investing long term. Another assumption is landlords assume to prioritize making money from renters. They assume that landlords need to do only what they need to do and comply with existing code, which often not stretch codes. I see assume renters don't want a responsibility of home ownership, which majority of us know that is not true at all. Realistic presumption is that people are not able to afford a home in a neighborhood where they want to live. Yeah. Assume that the relationship between the renters and landlords is difficult, not easily facilitating investments in apartment buildings. And like I said, if any of these resonate with you, where you're like, oh, that's exactly what I was thinking, could just go ahead in there and react in the chat. Assumptions that renters don't need to know about electrification, assumption that the lived experience of renters and owners is less valuable than statistics, reports, technical charting. Yes, that is so true. And so this is a great icebreaker question for inside your organizations when you're about to do campaign strategy and you're determining what campaigns you should do. You can say, hey, what assumptions do we make around X group of people that we're trying to engage in this group, and making it explicit, like hash out those assumptions, even across your team, because a lot of us make decisions based off of those unconscious assumptions. But if we don't make them explicit with each other, we can't even hold each other accountable. I can't be like, hey, you know what, Susie Q, I know that you shared that you kind of have some unconscious associations with low-class people and their desirability to do X, Y, and Z. And I saw in that meeting that you were kind of just voting down no on this campaign that such and such recommended. And I think it may be kind of rooted in your bias. It's easier across your teams if you get them to share out for us and their peers to be able to hold each other accountable when you're making decisions that are rooted in your bias. And that's that explicit part. All right, I see some stuff in group 4, building owners or property managers, energy efficiency bias. Renters don't care about decarb in their buildings. Yeah. Renters don't care about much utilities. Yeah, that's so true. Assumption that millennial renters don't care about their communities, which is not true. Side note, explaining the importance of certain upgrades to my landlord is difficult. They are always busy with other properties to tend to, or sometimes don't pay attention to renters of lowest economic status. Yes, the power that certain renters have versus the power that other renters have is like another implicit bias, right? Like luxury apartment renters, what power do they have when they go and advocate for things compared to folks who are on assistance, right? And that's like another implicit bias for people who are in the decision-making role, right? And it could be explicit bias if they've already been called out on it before. All right, I see the chat coming in. Does someone want to share? I see someone about to talk.
I would say something, especially if they've been called out on it before.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's where, you know, that line in that image we were talking about, when does it become explicit bias and start shifting into an ism? Right there, right? Like you've been called out, we let you know that's not okay, we've corrected you, and you're still behaving and practicing something that we said was not it, right? And so if any of my white allies who hear me saying this and you're like, man, I feel like I've been in a conversation where we had that is one of the places where you have a unique positionality and role to be accountability partners to folks who are explicitly using their bias in a way that's harmful to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in decarbonization work. The role is, the sweat equity is not on people of color to demand our humanity in this work. That sweat equity is actually on our white peers and our accountability partners to hold accountable their peers and being inherently biased. Often it ends up following on people of color because of course we're going to defend our humanity, but should it be on us to defend our humanity? Not on us alone. Okay, I know that's the hard part because it's like, man, I have to call out my friend. Yeah. Either you gonna call her out, or a person of color, or a low-income person, or a renter, or they're gonna call them out, and it may not be as gentle as your call out, or even as well received. Okay, all right, I'm getting my screen share back up. Thank you everyone for sharing in the chat. I am going to summarize these all into notes that everyone can be able to read across a document so you can see all the through lines in the work that we do. So I am a type of facilitator on the fly, and I like to do things based on how folks are doing. So I'm gonna do a brief temperature check before we go forward, but I'm gonna read this quote, which I know some of you are like, Stephanie, I know this quote. Well, I'm just gonna read it just to center us. So there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. The reason why this is really important is we're not talking about implicit bias in a shell. We're talking about implicit bias in regards to all of our work and whatever sectors of work that we're doing. We know that not everyone's climate issue will be your priority climate issue, right? In my breakout, we were talking about some of the climate issues and how they're relative to certain folks. But let's do a temperature check. So we have about 30 minutes left together, and I want to take y'all where you want to go. So where would you like to go next? One in the chat if you're like, I need to understand the history that got us here, because I don't even know, like, is there even historical reasons why implicit bias is tied into everything we do? Put a 1 in the chat. You can only pick one number, so don't give me 2 numbers, y'all. We don't have enough time for that, only 1 number. 3 is, I need to get to climate justice and environmental justice. I feel like that's always somewhere where we're just divided and we're just not aligned, and I just want to talk about that. Okay, and then put a 5 in the chat if you're like, no, I want to talk more in breakouts by sector and get into the weeds of like, what are actually the practices that implicit bias shows up in, so we can start coming up with a plan on how to combat it. All right, so I'm gonna just give us folks a second to just communicate where you want to go. And it doesn't mean we won't get to it all over the course of these next 2 days. We just may not get to, we're not going to get to all 3 of those today. We're only going to be able to do 1 to stay on time. Wait. It looks like we have 8 3s and 2 5s. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I know we have like 27 folks on here, so I want to give folks time to reply. Okay, thank you, Tammy. Okay. So I see 3 is about to have it, unless a whole bunch of renegade 5s are going to come in. Okay. All right. So I see folks saying I'll agree with the consensus. So it seems like everyone wants to dive into climate justice and the environmental justice approach. All right. So this is going to be a little fun and off the cuff. So what I'll do is I will stop. Okay, I see another 3. I'm gonna stop screen sharing. I know we often need to start with the history first because people are lacking basic understanding, both white and BIPOC. So then yeah, I agree. It's not that we won't get to it over the next 2 days. It's just what we'll be able to cover today in the next 30 minutes. Okay. All right. All right, so let's just jump into it. So let me make sure this is big enough for everyone to read, because I already heard someone say, Stephanie, your font is too small. I'm so sorry, respectfully. As someone who has a mother who's vision impaired, I should know better. All right, so let me know if this is better. All right. So climate justice insists on the shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impact at its heart. Right? Climate justice generally focuses on the shift of the impact, reducing the change in the climate, right? But environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. Okay, and you're like, Stephanie, that still kind of sounds like the same thing. I know, but it's not, okay? To get really specific, and I'm going to like cut out this other slide because someone said there's too many words, so I got you. Okay. So when we talk about climate justice, we're going to focus on talking about these 2 different approaches. This is actually supposed to be in the pre-reading, but I added to your homework because it's like 2 pages and it's a published scholarly article, so it's not a fun read, but it's helpful. So there's a distinction between the 2 different ways in which people might approach issues of climate justice, right? And one is isolationism. For those who were with me last year, you're like, oh, I remember this word. We talked about this, right? And the isolation holds that it is best to treat the ethical issues posed by climate change in isolation from other issues, such as poverty, migration, trade, and so forth. And then the second approach is integrationism. It holds that it is best to treat the ethical issues posed by climate change in light of a general theory of justice in conjunction with other issues. Okay. And so I don't know about y'all, but sometimes I'm on climate calls and people will be debating, talking about the strategy and the tactics they can use. And I plot them and I'm like, man, this person is isolationist, where they believe that how we're going to get to climate justice by isolating, just focusing on the benefit of the health outcome, right? And then I'll hear another person who's trying to solve the same problem, but they're an integrationist, right? They're like, the only way we're going to get to collective liberation and to our outcome of justice is by looking at how our decisions impact and intersect through all of these other issues, right? And so I just want to pause there and be like, hey, y'all, based on your organization, where are you? Are you all an isolationist organization where you're like, we view our approach to climate justice be just looking at improving the climate outcomes? Or are you an integrationist organization where you're like, actually, we view that we can't get to that outcome without considering all the levels of class and humanity and other people that are involved in it? So if you're like, Stephanie, my org is the isolationist org, we just focus on reducing the amount of carbon that is in my city. That's the major thing that we want to do. then put a 1 in the chat. And if you're like, no, we're integrationists, like we just don't focus on that. We see that this is a class issue, and this is a working family issue, and this is a climate migrants issue, put a 2 in the chat. Thank you, Eslin. And if this is hard for you to answer, that's okay. Thank you, Linda. If you don't know, that's okay. I appreciate the shrug. All right, so I see we have a lot of integrationists. I see Sarah shared that sometimes we talk about buildings in absence of people who live and work in those buildings, which is isolationist, exactly. But often I bring up more integrationist approaches, projects is being developed, connecting the dots is a constant thing. Decarb equals health plus reducing burden plus jobs. Exactly, Sarah. But sometimes it's good to have a name for it, how folks are showing up in regards to their theory on how they viewed we can solve these problems, right? Cheryl said some groups focus just their race in relation to all the other issues. That is true. That's like integrationist approach. Alyssa said a little bit of both, which a lot of orgs, that's kind of what they do. Or they're practicing one and trying to strive for the other. I think we aspire to be integrationists, thank you, Ashley, but are not there yet. Yeah, a lot of folks are like, technically isolationist org, but you're practicing integrationism, right? Like you just really don't know what it looks like in practice or what it feels like, but you know how you've been doing it isn't really inclusive, right? And so some of our orgs are right there in the middle. Yeah, integrating. I'm part of both types. One is shifted from isolation to integration last 5 years. Exactly, Kimberly. A lot of our orgs who are going through that transformation work, you all may be floating somewhere in the middle, but it's good to like, one, know this terminology, especially when you're talking across your peer groups and you all are trying to make decisions and it's getting kind of heated because it seems like the how we do something is conflicted. And it's just good to have a name for it. Because you can say, hey, you know what, Susie Q, I know that you really want to do X, Y, and Z because it's going to improve this climate outcome. But that's really an isolated approach. And we want to make sure this next community event that we do really looks at all the through lines in regards to class and race and working families in regards to this climate issue. Yes, exactly. Thank you. In reality, we are transforming for the greater good for all. Exactly. It's just like the how we get there and who we're prioritizing first, right? And so the reason why I dive into isolationism and integrationism is because the how we want to fight for climate liberation is uniquely different based on the subgroups of folks that we are focusing on. And for folks who have been from sacrifice communities like myself, where I have 4 generations of asthmatics in my family, I don't have patience for isolationism. I don't personally, like emotionally, personally, I don't have patience for it. Like, it's just not for me, right? And other folks on the call that may resonate for you. You may be like, Stephanie, I don't have patience for isolationism either, right? But it's good for you to know that you don't have patience for it, so you have a name for it, so you can call folks in when you're having calls and you're like, look, I can only work on integrationism work as a Black woman with Black family who live in a frontline community. I can only do integrationist work, right? It just doesn't fulfill me. It doesn't give me purpose work. I don't see like how it liberates my community. All right. And then when we talk about environmental justice, as we know by the EPA, that is that fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. All right, we've all heard that definition from the EPA. All right. But when how it relates to these two approaches is integrationism under the guise of climate justice is a component of that is environmental justice. Because having the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people is looking at those ethical issues that are posed by climate change, right? And so often the through line, when people are like, what, climate change and environmental justice are synonymous. No. Because when we think about it in this approach of isolationism and integrationism, climate justice really focuses on what are the shifts of those climate impacts, focusing just on the climate impacts, right? Like someone shared, not necessarily considering the people in the building, right? Integrationism, one of the components is also environmental justice, because it's not only meaningful involvement of all people at the table, but then it's also making sure that there are better enforcement of those laws, those regulations, those policies that we were naming in the beginning that are inherently biased, right? And so often when we're talking about climate justice and environmental justice, you see folks that use it synonymous, it's not, but one is really rooted on those outcomes, where the other is rooted on the systems and the policies and the social construct that humans have created to perpetuate these environmental injustices. And just see if anyone has any questions. If you're like, Stephanie, this is very helpful for me, I feel like I have somewhat of a better understanding, go ahead and put a 5 in the chat. If you're like, Stephanie, I'm even more confused than when I started, go ahead, give me a 1. I will take it respectfully. And if you're like, no, I actually feel, somewhere in the middle where I feel a little bit better, but I'm still a little confused, go ahead and give me a 3 in the chat. I just want to do a check-in to see how folks are feeling after this explanation in these slides. Great. 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 I see a lot of 5s. That's great to hear. And hopefully being able to have this context of the isolationism, integrationism can help you all when going back to your teams and having some of those how conversations. All right, I see some 4s, and that's okay, Linda and Tammy. I will share all these resources, and then also tomorrow we'll dive a little bit more into this together. Right, just giving folks a little bit more time. Okay. All righty, I don't see any other numbers coming in. I'm guessing after I sleep on it, I'll be at a 5 tomorrow. Okay, no worries, Tammy. Sometimes it takes time to process information. Okay, y'all. So I'm gonna move us through this because I did move the slide. Yes, next week. Because I did move the slides around because we jumped around, you may see some stuff we're just not gonna cover today, but I'll move to next week so that we can have more time to dive into this together. But I just want to be cognizant of time. So y'all, in case you didn't know, injustice is what got us here. It's what got us to this point that we're at right now. But injustice isn't where we're left to stand, right? Environmental injustice, as we all know, is about the people in Detroit. It's about folks who are chronically ill because of exposure to toxins. It's, there's often all those associations that people have of Midwesterners. Do you say soda? Do you say pop? What are those things that you want in your community versus the East Coast or the Gulf cities? And so we must be careful as local stewards of climate and environmental justice to ensure that associations and how it shows up and how we make decisions is made explicitly, and that we commit to come correctly moving forward. All right, so I'm going to skip through these slides because this was the history slides that someone said, oh, I would love for us to do that. So I'll just make time for us to kind of talk through the history, the indicators around health, around being kept out, about the Community and Reinvestment Act. I actually have a timeline that talks around the strategic policies and decisions that were made to intentionally push folks into redline communities, which we know is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC. And these are those mapped areas where there tend to be those higher corresponding air pollution. And so I'm just kind of going through this quickly because we're going to dive more into this next week. And so we will talk about like redlining, and although it's illegal now, there's still some policies and practices and barriers that still linger that show up in decarbonization work, right? And so that's going to be some of your homework to think around what are some of those policies and practices. And for those of you who did it last year, you probably already know, but we're going to work through those together. All right. And so with that, I'm just trying to flip through the slides. All right. Thank you, Sylvia. Oh, no problem. All right, y'all. Let me move us through the activity. Okay. So I'm skipping around because, like I said, y'all had me jump some slides, but it's okay. We're flexible. We got this. So I just want to like end this training today with us understanding that we can disagree and still love each other. But unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression, in my denial of my humanity and right to exist. And so I know I've been calling out a lot of our white allies on this call, but I just want to make it in like completely explicit that the transformation process of the climate justice movement is rooted in you all committing to be accountability partners to your peers. Okay, BIPOC folk can help coach. We can help you, give you tactics. We can give you guidance on no words, but the sweat equity isn't on us alone to ensure that our humanity and our right to exist is here. It is you and your positionality in certain spaces that you have being able to call your peers in and be like, you know what you said to such and such on that call, I know it may have been well-intended, but how it came off was really problematic. And to be able to have those conversations with them so that the spaces continue to feel brave and comfortable for folks to come forward and share, okay? So, all right, y'all, I want us to shake that off. That was a lot for day one. We talked about assumptions, presumptions, implicit bias, explicit bias. We talked about what sectors of work that you're in. We talked through environmental justice and climate justice. And so I just want you all to just share one word to describe how you feel. You know, if you're feeling anxious, put anxious. I won't take it personal. If you're feeling inquisitive, put inquisitive. But just one word to describe how you feel. Thank you. I see some hopeful. I see some motivated. I see determined. Thank you, Linda. Fantastic teaching. That's 2 words. I'll take it. Yes, open to keep doing better, more confident, uncertain. That's fair. Emboldened, curious, accountable, motivated. Yes. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to do our last few temperature checks before we open it up for questions. So y'all, now that we've done all of this, how well do you understand implicit bias now? Do a 5 of you, you're like completely, I got it. You got me up to speed, Stephanie. I'm ready to go. And 3, you're like, man, I'm still a little murky, Stephanie. I mean, I got everything you said and I saw the nice slides, but it just didn't, I don't know. I'm still in the middle. And 1 is like, still not at all. I'm lost. What is implicit bias? All right. All right, I see some 5s of 4.8. Thank you, Sarah. Rachel, thank you. All right, I see a lot of 5s, which we started off with a lot of 3s, you know, so that means folks have been shifted where you're like, okay, I got this. I see how it shows up. And I just wanted to lift something up that someone just chatted me directly. BIPOC people can have implicit bias too, y'all. Just so you know, it's not just a one-sided thing, you know? And it can still be valid. It can be rooted in lived experience, right? Like I've had enough people try to come up and pet my head that sometimes when I see certain people coming close with their hand out, I automatically assume and clench up because I think they're going to try to pet my hair, right? And so, but that's based on my lived experience, right? Does that mean that, you know, I'm explicitly racist? No, but it does mean that in certain times when I see certain people of a certain age and demographic approach me based on my lived experience, I may flex and respond differently, right? That's something Lena was talking about in the beginning, or we may not feel comfortable enough to come forward because we've had so many experiences of our voice being minimized that we don't even want to take up space, right? Okay. All right, this is the last check-in until I pass it to Maggie. Is how well do you understand implicit bias now in its relation to decarbonization work? 5, you're like, yeah, I see the through line. I got it. I'm there. 3, you're like, nah. I see some of it, but I don't see it in my sector per se. And 1 is like, not at all. Thank you, Ashley. 4.5. All right. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Eslin. $4.5. Thank you, Cheryl. Linda, thank you. Okay. All right, y'all. So these are the key takeaways. The tactics to addressing implicit bias. Become aware. That was the first step today. I want you all to think through what are some of my implicit biases that I have in my work? Write them down. Make a journal. Think through them. Learn from them. If you have implicit bias about renters, maybe you need to have a renter listening session and learn from them. Talk to people who organize renters. Learn and unpack your own biases and make sure that they're somewhat rooted in evidence, right? They're more presumptions than assumptions. Listen, be an active listener. If you are the person who starts talking to someone and then you halfway zone out by what they say because you assume you already know what they're going to say, that's not actively listening. Especially marginalized people, we're used to being halfway listened to. It just lets us know that you're really not about this work, right? And then the last is recognize. Recognize that diversity is real, the dynamic and the legitimacy. There is more than one way we can do anything, okay? All right. And so what's next is we will be together next week. We will dive into day 2. In this day, we will be diving into white supremacy culture. I know, y'all, some people don't like that word, but we got to talk about it. And we're going to talk about how it shows up in the work that we do and what those tactics are. And we're going to put names on them. We're going to give examples. And so I need y'all to come ready to get a little uncomfortable because white supremacy culture is real. And it's rooted in a lot of the work that we do and how we do the work. And if you're like, Stephanie, you talked about homework so much. This is what your homework will be like. It'll be a worksheet. It'll list out the process, the decisions, and the resource, and you'll talk through the consequences. So an example is, hey, I assume people can attend strategy meetings during the workday. The consequence of doing that is that funding will go to communities with privilege and not the communities that are most heavily impacted, right? A consequence of doing that is less invested marginalized communities if they were excluding from the planning strategy process. So your homework will involve you kind of unpacking and thinking through what assumptions does your group make and thinking through what are the consequences of those assumptions. And so with that, I am going to stop screen sharing and pass it over to you, Maggie. Thank you everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. Let's give her some love in the chat. I see some of those clap emojis. Some of y'all off or like on camera, giving that love out right now. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing these past 2 hours with us. I honestly think that flew by faster than any other 2-hour meeting I have been a part of recently. So super appreciate your wisdom and everyone participating here. So I went ahead and put that link to register for next week's session in the chat. After this meeting, I will get the recording put together for anyone who wasn't able to join us live today. And then I'll get with Stephanie too to make sure everybody has access to that homework, to the pre-reading for next week and those slides and all those other resources she was able to share out with us. And with that, I think we're good to wrap for this afternoon. And I hope everyone has a great Friday. Oh, and then I just see that link in the chat to the workbook. Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie, for putting that in there. Cool. All right, alrighty. I will close this out then, everybody. Thank you so much, and hope to see y'all back here next week, same time.